Strange rules governed the rhythm of life in the medieval dynasty, where law was not merely a tool for order, but a reflection of cosmic balance. Imagine a world where your fate might rest on whether the wind blew a certain way or whether a bell was heard at the wrong hour. In the sleepy corners of forgotten villages, the law crept into every part of life. It wasn't just about punishment or justice. It was about preserving a fragile harmony between heaven and earth, between man and animal, between sin and survival. One such law concerned the rooster. In some parts of medieval Europe, if a rooster laid an egg, a rare, but biologically possible, event, it was considered a sign of deep evil. The people believed such an egg could hatch a basilisk, a mythical creature capable of killing with a single glance. The rooster, therefore, could not be allowed to live. A local tribunal might gather. Witnesses would be called. The bird, often unaware of its supposed crime, would be sentenced and executed publicly, lest misfortune fall upon the entire village. It wasn't just fear, but duty. If even a single unnatural event went unpunished, the entire moral order of the world could begin to unravel. Other laws reached into the silence of the night. In some dynasties, the tolling of church bells after dark was strictly regulated. It was believed that the ringing might summon unclean spirits or awaken restless souls. Monks kept careful watch over bell ropes, and records show that certain abbeys fined brothers who rang after curfew even accidentally. Silence was sacred. The air after sunset belonged to the unseen, and disturbing it was not a matter taken lightly. Even the humble well had its rules. Wells were sacred places, sources, not just of water, but of stories, blessings, and curses. In some villages, tossing anything other than coins into a well was a punishable offense. If someone were to spit into a well, they could be tried for poisoning the water and cursing the land. In particularly severe cases, a person might be exiled. Wells, after all, were shared by entire communities. Polluting one was tantamount to violence. There were laws that governed shadows. In a few scattered chronicles from the 12th century, there are reports of trials involving reflections. It was believed by some that the soul could be seen in water or polished metal. If a reflection was distorted or missing, it was a sign of hidden sin. A woman accused of witchcraft might be led to a stream where she would be asked to look down. If the water failed to show her image clearly, the watching villagers might begin to murmur. The law could not prove witchcraft directly, but it could act on signs. And signs were everywhere. The medieval legal mind loved order and boundaries. Shoes, for instance, had rules of their own. In some towns, it was forbidden to wear shoes with tips longer than 6 inches. Long-toed shoes, popular with nobles, were seen as symbols of pride and vanity. One law in 15th century London required men of lower rank to wear shoes with blunt, squared toes, so as not to appear above their station. Punishment for violation ranged from fines to public shaming. Pride, after all, was a spiritual crime. The law had an obligation to help people remain humble. Hair was another subject of strange regulation. In some Benedictine monasteries, monks were required not just to shave their heads, but to do so according to precise geometry. The tonsure, that distinctive circular bald spot, symbolized spiritual purity. But the law required it to be exactly measured 2 finger widths from the crown in all directions. An irregular tonsure could lead to suspicion of heresy. They believed held power. To grow it or cut it incorrectly was to risk inviting chaos. Then there were rules about color. In the medieval mind, colors were not simply aesthetic choices. They had spiritual weight. Red was passion and danger. Green was fertility and wildness. Black was death and dignity. In some dynasties, peasants were forbidden to wear bright colors on feast days. Only the nobility could wear scarlet or gold. These sumptuary laws weren't just about class, they were about preserving the sacred order. A laborer in red might confuse the eye of heaven. Better to remain in earth tones, so that angels might recognize their stations. Churches, unsurprisingly, held many of the era's strangest rules. In some regions, it was forbidden to sneeze during the gospel reading. Sneezing was believed to be a physical rejection of holy words. Priests recorded such incidents and sometimes refused communion to repeat offenders. The act of suppressing a sneeze became a mark of piety. Parishioners trained themselves to hold their breath at key moments, praying not to betray their inner soul through an involuntary noise. In the same spirit, yawning was regulated in monastic codes. A yawn during prayer was thought to be an invitation to the devil, so monastic orders issued quiet reprimands to novices who yawned without covering their mouths. The mouth was the gate of the soul. To open it carelessly was to risk letting something in nor something out. Silence, in general, was guarded with fierce devotion. In some abbeys, the law required complete silence from dusk until dawn. Words spoken after dark were recorded as infractions, and repeat offenders might be denied food. Silence was not just restful, it was sacred. The night belonged to the divine. Speaking in the dark was like shouting into the heavens. Legal codes even extended to dreams. In certain courts influenced by early Germanic law, repeated nightmares were admissible as evidence. If a villager claimed to have dreamt of a neighbor cursing them and then fell ill, the dream could be used in court proceedings. The neighbor would be questioned. Witnesses would be called to discuss past behaviors, strange glances, whispered words. Though impossible to prove or disprove, dreams carried legal weight in a world where the supernatural was part of daily life. In medieval dynasties, doors could be legal witnesses. If someone fled into a church and touched the heavy iron door, they could claim sanctuary. No one, not even the king's men, could drag them away. That door, that cold barrier between the sacred and the profane, became their protection. But if they stepped outside, even a toe crossed the threshold, they could be seized. In some cases, guards waited for days or even weeks, watching the doors, hoping the accused would wander out by mistake or desperation. These laws may sound surreal, even dreamlike, yet they governed real people with real consequences. The rules weren't random. They were built from belief that everything mattered, that every action had echoes in eternity. To us, they seem strange, but to those who lived under them, they were as natural as rain. In the shadows of castle walls and beneath the watchful gaze of parish churches, medieval marriage laws wove their curious patterns into the fabric of everyday life. In the grand halls of nobles and the humble cottages of peasants alike, the joining of two souls was governed by rules that reached beyond affection and blood. It was not merely a contract between individuals, but a covenant binding families, communities, and even entire regions. Imagine a peasant girl whose destiny was determined by the ripeness of her family's harvest, or a noble son whose choice of bride could tip the balance of power between dukedOMs. From the moment a child was born, whispers of alliances began to stir. Among the high-born infants were betrothed at a tender age, sometimes before they could walk, so that their futures were preordained. These arranged unions were seen as essential political tools. A teenage princess might be promised to a foreign prince as part of a peace treaty, even as her own heart fluttered innocently at the sight of daisies in the courtyard. To refuse such an alliance was unthinkable. To comply was a duty that transcended personal desire. In villages, the practice was less formal, but no less binding. A young man who sought a neighbor's daughter was required to secure her. Fathers consent and provide a dowry, a portion of goods or livestock, to prove his commitment. This dowry served not only as a symbol of worth, but as a safety net for the bride, ensuring her care should her husband die or stray. In some regions, the dowry was so substantial that widows could live independently for years, trading cheese and wool in the market to preserve their livelihood. Yet dowries carried their own peculiar laws. If a marriage failed to produce children after a set number of years, often 7, some courts allowed the wife to reclaim her dowry. This law, though seldom invoked, was a recognition of women's contribution to lineage and property. It spoke of a balance between male and female roles, however precarious that balance might have been. The failure to bear an heir threatened not only personal reputations, but the continuity of land and title. Wedding ceremonies themselves were governed by a host of regulations that varied from one duchy to another. In some parts of France, marriages could not be solemnized on Fridays or during Lent, lest the joy of union offend religious sensibilities. Bells were forbidden on feast days of the Virgin Mary, so as not to overshadow her own festival with human celebration. Priests were careful to record the precise hour and location of the ceremony in parish registers. For irregularities such as a midnight wedding in a field could cast doubts on legitimacy for generations. Once married, couples entered into a world of obligations and prohibitions. Adultery was a crime of passion and betrayal, punishable by fines, public humiliation, or even imprisonment. But the severity of punishment often depended on social rank and gender. A nobleman might escape, with a slap on the wrist if his transgression was discreet, while a peasant woman caught in the same act could be whipped at the pillory. In Denmark and parts of Germany, certain cities mandated that adulterous wives pay a fine in the form of a barrel of beer, to be shared among the villagers during a public festival, an oddly convivial form of penance. Inheritance laws added further complexity, especially when multiple marriages and blended families came into play. Primogeniture, the right of the firstborn son to inherit all titles and lands, prevailed among many noble families. Younger sons had to seek their fortunes through the church, the military, or advantageous marriages. Daughters often received only a token portion of inheritance, their security lying in the dowry and in law's goodwill. In regions influenced by Salic law, daughters were entirely barred from succession, regarded as conduits rather than bearers of lineage, yet local. Customs sometimes diverged from these strictures. In parts of Brittany and Normandy, daughters could inherit if there were no sons, preventing estates from splintering or passing to distant male relatives. These exceptions underscored the fluidity of medieval law, shaped as much by regional tradition as by overarching royal edicts. Marriage disputes often landed in ecclesiastical courts where canon law held sway. These courts could grant annulments for reasons such as consanguinity being too closely related by blood or lack of consent. Even the whisper of coercion could unravel a union. A young bride who claimed she had been forced into wedlock might bring forth a defense of innocence, supported by character witnesses who swore on relics. The threat of excommunication loomed over any who apostatized or defied church rulings. For to live outside the fold was to court spiritual oblivion. Equally strange were the laws governing marital separation. In some Italian city-states, merchants could dissolve their marriages if they traveled for trade and remained apart for a decade. Such protracted absences constituted tacit abandonment, recognized by courts that balanced mercantile necessity with marital fidelity. A wife left behind could remarry after proving that her husband had failed to return despite fair summons. This pragmatic approach acknowledged the realities of long-distance commerce in a world where travel was fraught with peril beyond Europe's borders. Christian dynasties coexisted with Islamic and Jewish communities, each with their distinct marital codes. In the Iberian Peninsula, the convivencia of faiths produced a tapestry of overlapping regulations. Muslim law allowed men multiple wives and required written consent for divorce, while Jewish law granted women ketubah rights, contractual guarantee of financial support in the event of dissolution. These parallel systems sometimes clashed, requiring royal arbiters to negotiate solutions for interfaith marriages and inheritance disputes. In the quiet hours before dawn, when candle flames flickered and cloistered monks chanted faintly in the setier distance, these intricate laws took on a dreamlike quality. They were not abstractions, but threads woven through every life story. A couple might exchange vows under the gaze of a half-moon, aware that their union was watched by priests, neighbors, and the invisible forces believed to govern the universe. The choice of a wedding day, the length of a husband's cloak, the shape of a bride's veil all carried legal weight. As you drift deeper into sleep, allow your mind to wander through these ancient chambers where love and law danced in tandem. Feel the hush of stone corridors, the rustle of silk gowns, the solemn toll of bells marking vows exchanged in twilight. In that world, every heartbeat was part of a grand covenant, every whispered promise a thread in the tapestry of destiny. The strange rules of medieval marriage remind us that even in darkness, there was order. Order meant to guide, protect, and sometimes confine those who dared to bind their lives together. The streets of the medieval city carried their own laws, many of them as peculiar as they were precise. Cobblestone paths bustled with markets, preachers, beggars, animals, and travelers, but none of them could move freely without navigating the silent rules that shaped public behavior. You could be fined for emptying a chamber pot from the wrong window, punished for wearing your sword at the wrong hour, or dragged before the magistrate for baking bread on a forbidden day. Of the city were like invisible threads, weaving control into every step you took. Take, for instance, the law of the shoemaker's sound. In parts of France and the Low Countries, cobblers were forbidden from hammering before sunrise on feast days. The rhythm of their work, tap, 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 was believed to disturb the angels as they passed overhead. If a town priest reported the offense, the cobbler might be made to pay a candle to the church, one for every blow struck before the appointed hour. This created entire mornings of silence in the artisan quarters, where hands remained still until church bells gave permission. To begin the day, the regulation of scent was another quiet law, mostly unwritten but fiercely enforced by guilds and neighbors alike. Fishmongers were required to keep their goods covered during midday hours, lest the heat offend passers-by. Tanners and butchers were relegated to the city's edges, where the wind might carry their smells away from noble noses. In some cities, soapmakers had to close shop during Lent, because the scent of perfume and oil was considered a temptation against fasting. To smell good in the wrong season was to court suspicion. Street musicians, too, walked a legal tightrope. All music was welcome during festivals and processions. Playing a lute or drum at the wrong time could be considered incitement. A tune played near the town hall might be seen as mockery. A love song outside a maiden's window could be interpreted as slander. Fines varied from a few coins to the public destruction of the offending instrument. In one documented case, a fiddler was sentenced to carry his broken instrument around the square as a symbol of shame, with a sign hung around his neck that read, "He played when none asked." Clothing, as always, was watched closely by the eyes of the law. On many medieval cities, sumptuary codes dictated not only the colors one could wear, but the fabric, the buttons, the embroidery, and even the width of sleeves. A servant might be fined for wearing silk. A merchant's wife could be shamed for donning pearls. In Florence, laws required prostitutes to wear yellow veils, a mark that blurred the line between punishment and advertisement. Yet in some cities, these women were allowed to dress more richly than common wives, to keep their trade visible but distinguishable. The result was a strange visual code, understood by all, yet spoken by none. Even walking had its rules. There were laws that dictated which side of the street you must walk on, depending on your social rank. Nobles kept to the middle, while tradesmen hugged the edge. To cross paths incorrectly was to risk insult. A peasant brushing shoulders with a bishop could be accused of impudence. In one small German town, records show a baker was fined for refusing to yield the path to a visiting abbot. His defense, that he had flour on his hands and meant no harm, was dismissed. Respect, after all, had to be visible. Animals were constant companions in these winding lanes, but they, too, had laws. In certain towns, pigs had to be muzzled if they roamed freely. A pig without a muzzle could be seized by the bailiff and later returned only after a fine was paid. Dogs larger than a spaniel were not allowed in markets on holy days, lest they frighten children or upset stalls. Horses had to be walked, not ridden, through the city gates on Sundays. The city belonged to the soul on those days, and any clatter of hooves was seen as a challenge to its peace. Beggars were not exempt from regulation. They were permitted to sit in designated corners, often near church doors, but only during certain hours. To beg after vespers was to risk punishment, for it was believed that true piety was offered in daylight, not in the lingering shadows. Some cities issued tokens to approved beggars, small lead discs that they wore on strings around their necks. These tokens marked them as lawful, and without one, a beggar could be whipped, banished, or imprisoned. Public fountains carried a surprising number of rules. You were not allowed to wash your face in them after noon. Horses could not drink unless it was Friday. Drawing water in buckets larger than a certain size was forbidden to prevent hoarding. In dry seasons, the watchman of the fountain kept a record of who drew water and when, and arguments over turn-taking could lead to full-blown legal disputes. These fountains were more than simple utilities. They were community thresholds, watched closely and respected silently. One of the strangest laws involved silence itself. In Bruges, for a brief period during the early 14th century, there was a curfew on singing. After the bell of ninth hour, no one man, woman, or child was allowed to sing in the streets. The law was passed after a series of brawls broke out between rival guilds who mocked one another through songs. Silence, the council believed, would restore peace. Yet the silence was filled with whispers, and the city took on an eerie hush. After the curfew, as if every note had been plucked from the air, even the act of buying and selling had hidden restrictions. In some markets, you could not haggle aloud. Negotiations had to be conducted in hushed voices, so as not to disturb the sacred order of trade. Loud haggling was thought to anger the gods of commerce, figurative beings invoked half-seriously by merchants, who guarded their stalls like altars. If someone raised their voice too high while disputing a price, nearby sellers would fall silent in disapproval, and the offender might be escorted away by the beadles. Laws about food preparation grew ever more elaborate. In parts of medieval Spain, you could not cook fish on a roof. The smell, carried by the wind, might disrupt fasting neighbors. Boiling beans outdoors was forbidden during mourning periods. Certain herbs, especially garlic and fennel, were banned from use in town cook fires during major religious processions, lest their strong odors rise above the incense. A meal, it was believed, should know its place. The city was full of watchmen, beadles, bailiffs, and scribes, each recording the infractions of daily life in neat, faded ink. Their books were filled with names, dates, offenses so small they barely registered a sneeze at the wrong hour, a shoe mended too loudly, a gesture made without bowing first. Yet these infractions were serious in their time. They were signals that something, however slight, had fallen out of order. As sleep draws nearer, imagine the city quieting at dusk. The stalls are closed, the dogs muzzled, the beggars vanished into doorways. Bells chime softly, and the final candle in the baker's shop is snuffed out. Law walks silently down the cobbled streets, invisible but ever present, wrapping the town in rules like a blanket. Strange, yes, but to the people who lived within them, they were the lines that held the world together. Beyond the towns and city walls, deep in the rural heartlands of the medieval dynasty, strange laws governed the countryside with a quiet firmness that few dared challenge. These weren't always written down or read aloud in courts, but they lived in the mouths of elders, in the customs of tenants, and in the whispers passed between generations. The open fields, the forests, and even the rivers all carried expectations of behavior rules made not only by kings and barons, but by time itself. The forest, in particular, held a special category of law, often more feared than the king's justice. Royal forests were vast territories reserved for the hunting pleasure of the elite, and the laws protecting them were harsh and precise. To kill a deer within a royal forest without permission was not merely poaching, it was treason against the crown. A commoner caught snaring a rabbit or gathering fallen wood could lose a hand, or worse. Even breaking branches from a tree in these areas was seen as theft from the king's domain. Forest wardens patrolled these spaces with solemn purpose, often mounted and armed, and authorized to arrest intruders on sight. Whole families were sometimes accused of violating forest law if a single member was found with unpermitted game. In some cases, the mere possession of hunting tool straps, arrows, snares was evidence enough. There are records of men sentenced 2 years of servitude for being found with feathers in their caps, which could suggest they had been near falconers, or poaching grounds. The rivers, too, had their invisible rules. Fishing rights were jealously guarded by monasteries, lords, and guilds. In many places, peasants were only allowed to fish with nets of a certain size or poles of certain lengths. Anything larger was considered theft of God's bounty. Salmon, in particular, were the subject of intense legal scrutiny. A river near a monastery might only be fished on Tuesdays and Thursdays and only after Vespers. To break these rules could result in the confiscation of tools, the loss of livestock, or in some cases enforced fasting as penance. Even the bees had their protectors. Beekeeping was not just a cottage industry. It was regulated by law in surprising detail. Hives had to be kept a certain distance from property boundaries. If a swarm settled in a neighbor's tree, both parties had legal claims to the bees. And the honey, depending on where the swarm originated and where it rested. There are recorded disputes in which monks and peasants argued over the ownership of honeycomb found in hollow logs. In one case, the final ruling involved splitting the honey evenly, but requiring the bees to be returned to their original hive. Transported carefully in baskets at dawn, scarecrows, those quiet sentinels of the field, were not beyond the grasp of law. In certain regions, there were ordinances about what materials could be used to make them. Rags taken from religious garments, even discarded ones, were forbidden. To use the sleeve of a monk's robe to dress a scarecrow was seen as sacrilege. There were even rules about when they could be placed. Some villages had customs preventing scarecrows from being set out before the feast of St. Benedict, fearing that early placement would drive away not just crows but good spirits tied. To the fertility of the soil, the rules of planting and harvesting often had a ceremonial air. In parts of Eastern Europe, laws required that the first sheaf of wheat be offered to the church before any other bundles were collected. The sheaf was carried in a procession decorated with ribbons and holy symbols and placed near the altar. To forget this offering or to harvest secretly before the ceremony was believed to curse the fields for 7 years. Some landowners insisted on recording the exact hour of the first cut, believing that misalignment with the stars could affect the entire season's yield. Milking cows had their own laws, particularly in the highland communities. If a tenant's cow wandered into the Lord's pasture and returned with fuller udders than before, accusations of milk theft might arise. Such claims often relied on testimony from shepherd boys or old women, and the evidence was as much spiritual as physical. In some cases, accused milk thieves were forced to bless the cow publicly, swearing under oath that no enchantment or binding spell had been used to lure milk from their neighbor's beast. And there were laws for birds, especially those that sang too early or nested too close to chapels. In one record from a small English village, a complaint was made about a family of starlings that had taken up residence in the church eaves. Their constant chattering during Mass was interpreted as a disturbance to the divine service. A local law was invoked requiring the removal of the nest before Sunday, and a boy was tasked with climbing the steeple. When he fell and broke his arm, the incident was noted in the parish register, not as an accident, but as a divine warning against interfering with the natural order without proper blessing. Even sleep itself was regulated in rural law. On manorial estates, tenants were expected to rise at first light during planting season, and failure to appear in the fields within the prescribed hour could result in fines or loss of field privileges. Sleeping in during harvest time was a legal offense in some jurisdictions. Landowners believed that idle laborers threatened not just the economy, but the health of the soil. The land, they claimed, could feel neglect and would respond with blight. Certain sounds were subject to rules. The ringing of bells, the playing of horns, even the howling of dogs could trigger legal complaints. In parts of Ireland, a dog that howled 3 nights in a row was seen as a bringer of ill omen, and its owner could be ordered to tie the animal's mouth with cloth at sundown. In Wales, there were reports of people fined for using wind chimes during storms, the sound believed to attract mischievous spirits who delighted in knocking over fences and unseating riders from their horses. Fire was, perhaps, at the most sacred and most feared element in the countryside. Rules around its use were precise and cautious. No fires were to be lit on thatched roofs, even for cooking, and travelers were forbidden from carrying open flame into barns. During high summer, a proclamation might be issued banning the use of all forge fires for an entire month due to the risk of wildfire. Violators faced public punishment, sometimes involving water-dunking ceremonies intended to shame and cleanse. As night fell on the countryside, and only the stars remained to watch over the fields, these strange rules quietly took hold. The laws of the rural world didn't shout, they whispered. They were rules made of earth and sky, of tradition and superstition, of survival and sanctity. They told you when to walk, when to sing, when to milk, when to sleep. And in those darkened fields, where scarecrows stood still and silent, the rules lingered in the hush like ancient prayers sown into the soil. In the shadowed halls of castles and the echoing chambers of royal courts, the rules of the medieval dynasty took on an entirely different tones, theatrical, and at times quietly absurd. The law did not speak gently here. It arrived. In velvet robes and gilded seals, whispered by scribes and enforced by armored men. But behind the formality, the rituals, and the weighty judgments lay a system, so riddled with peculiar customs and strange exceptions that even seasoned nobles had to tread carefully. Royal proclamations, for instance, were not just spoken aloud, they had to be sung. In some kingdoms, a law could not be considered valid until it was publicly sung in the town square by a crier trained in plain chant. This was believed to imprint the words in the minds of listeners, using melody to fix meaning. If a proclamation was delivered without proper cadence, it could be contested. There are records of laws repealed because the appointed singer had gone hoarse and delivered the words in a raspy monotone, unfit for legal memory. The crowns themselves were subject to law. Curious tradition held that a monarch's crown could not be worn while issuing punishment. The weight of judgment, it was believed, must not be doubled by the weight of the crown. Kings and queens would remove their circlets before delivering sentences, handing them to attendants with bowed heads. This act was thought to purify the moment justice separated from majesty, law from legacy. To forget this ritual was rare, but when it happened, scribes noted it carefully. And some believed misfortunes followed. Courts of animals and objects, while more common in the countryside, were not unknown in the royal record. One particularly strange case from Burgundy involved a tapestry that had been accused of inciting rebellion. The tapestry, woven with scenes of mythical battles, had hung for decades in a noble estate, but after a failed uprising, it was seized as evidence. Witnesses claimed it had inspired unrest among young squires. The court ordered it burned, and the ruling described the fabric as treasonous by thread and tail. No one laughed. Law was written, and the tapestry was destroyed. Ceremonial seating arrangements were their own legal battleground. The placement of chairs at feasts, councils, and negotiations was governed by a strict hierarchy. To sit even slightly above one's rank could result in serious offense. In some courts, disputes over seating required formal apologies and public declarations of humility. A baron who sat beside a duke without invitation might be ordered to eat standing for a month at all court functions, as a reminder of his misstep. In one notable case, a bishop insisted on a cushion that placed him half an inch higher than a rival, and the matter was brought before the king for mediation. Color again played a part in royal law, but here it extended to entire rooms. In certain dynasties, rooms painted in blue were reserved for legal matters. While red rooms were meant for spiritual reflection, no law could be debated in a red room, just as no confession could be heard in a blue one. These color codes created logistical problems. Laws had to be relocated mid-discussion if a torch revealed a mispainted wall. It is said that one long debate over land rights was paused for 2 weeks while the chamber was repainted, lest the outcome be tainted by improper hue. The royal kitchens were bound by their own strict codes, enforced with a formality that seems almost comedic now. Goose could not be served unless its beak had been gilded first. An ancient tradition honoring a long-forgotten pact between a king and a neighboring duchy. No fish could be presented with its head pointing toward the queen, and any dish containing garlic had to be blessed before it was carried into the dining hall. If a servant failed to bow before presenting a plate, the entire meal was considered profaned, and the food was discarded. No matter how rare or expensive, the law even reached into matters of laughter. In the presence of the king, no one could laugh louder than the monarch himself. This was not just etiquette was written. Laughter exceeding that of the sovereign was seen as mocking, a potential insult to the ruler's wit. Courtiers developed the art of measuring their laughter, precisely starting soft and rising only if the king's chuckle grew. Jesters alone were exempt from this rule, but even they had limitations. Jests made during mourning periods could result in banishment or the symbolic shaving of half their hair, a sign of their offense. In trials involving nobility, oaths had to be sworn not only on the Bible, but also on relics specific to the accused house. A count might swear on the sword of his grandfather, a duchess on a relic ring said to contain a saint's hair. If the relic could not be produced, the oath was postponed. This gave rise to the peculiar role of relic guardians nobles appointed, specifically to maintain and transport family relics for use in legal matters. Their duty was sacred, and to lose a relic en route to a trial was considered a form of sabotage in disputes between noble families. The drawing of lots was a last resort, but even that was bound by strange law. The lots had to be carved from the wood of a tree that had never borne fruit, symbolizing neutrality. They were drawn blindfolded from a silver chalice, and the one who drew the stone, lot a small polished pebble, was said to be under divine judgment. That person's claim, regardless of strength, was considered weaker, and they were required to perform a public act of penance, usually a donation to the church or a vow of silence lasting several days. Even the royal dogs had legal standing. In certain courts, dogs belonging to the crown were given honorary titles. Harming one even by accident was treated as a crime against the royal household. These dogs were fed by special kitchen staff, their meals recorded in the palace ledgers. If a visiting noble's hound growled at a royal dog, a formal apology was expected. There is one account of a baron's spaniel that barked during a council meeting and was immediately removed from court for a year, along with its owner. Burial laws, too, could take strange turns. Nobles were sometimes buried with documents of unresolved disputes. It was believed that their spirits would remain restless until the matter was settled. In certain dynasties, grave markers were adjusted when verdicts changed. With new inscriptions added to reflect legal vindication, a tombstone might read, "Here lies Lord Edric, falsely accused, deemed in the 23rd year after his death." These posthumous declarations were meant not just for justice, but for the soul's peace. And so the strange rules of the medieval dynasty wound through every corner of the court, from feast to trial, from laughter to silence, from the crown to the kennel. Every gesture was measured, every sound watched, every color considered. The laws were not just tools of control. They were part of the choreography, part of the pageant that made up the very rhythm of medieval life. To walk those halls was to walk through a living scroll of customs, where each moment was touched by the invisible ink of tradition. As your thoughts settle, let the weight of those velvet laws rest gently on your chest. Let the soft echo of courtly footsteps fade into the stillness. The dynasty sleeps now, its strange rules folded neatly away for another dawn. And so may you drift quietly, lawfully into your own gentle peace. Thank you for joining me on this calm journey through the strange rules of medieval dynasties. If you enjoyed this quiet glimpse into history, please like, subscribe, share to help more restless minds find peaceful sleep. Until next time, may your nights be gentle and your dreams restful. Sleep well.